Hello and welcome to this video on the living nightmare fuel that is the half-life headcrab. Imagine for a moment that the headcrab is real. A small, fast-moving creature, maybe the size of a chicken, admittedly a large chicken. It lives by not just predating on humans, but worse. Its form of predation is to find a human and wait patiently in ambush until the human passes close enough for it to jump out and onto your head. Once on your head, it clamps down tightly and takes control of your body, if you don't get it off very quickly, and that's challenging by itself. Once in place, the headcrab is permanently in place until the host dies. The best comparable idea is that of the facehugger from Aliens. The difference between the facehugger and the headcrab is that, at least in theory, you can remove the facehugger or surgically, remove the parasitic xenomorph chest bust without killing the host, or is it better to say victim? Even that may only be partially necessary, as the facehugger dies not long after implanting the chestbuster xenomorph. Unlike the facehugger, the host of a headcrab does not die soon after the encounter. Instead, they become a shambling zombie-like entity. They remain that way until a physicist with a chip on their shoulder and a rather handy crowbar comes upon them, or they die from their body breaking down. All headcrabs have the ability to infect the host, and they will do so by not just landing on the head and biting down on it, but opening up the head and driving a probiscus-like structure down and into the spinal cord through its head. Connecting the working spinal cord to the headcrab gives the headcrab complete and utter control of its victim, let's say. This is of course ignoring the other issues, such as the fact that the headcrab is essentially an engineered weapon, launched into various places as an aerial denial weapon, very similar to, say, landmines, except these landmines move, and will react to, anyone and anything, seemingly only predate upon humans, and therefore not the aliens that would otherwise use them, and of course are, a rather terrifying psychological weapon. A terrifying psychological weapon that, at first glance, seems relatively benign. To be clear, weird and wonderful, but it doesn't look that threatening. Your average headcrab can vary slightly in colour, but overall the appearance is fairly consistent. It will change its coloration and its appearance slightly, but it's more or less the same across the differences. It is a somewhat spider-looking creature, but it has just 4 legs and is, obviously larger. It's compared to a pumpkin, or at most about half a metre across, or just under 2 feet. The headcrab is about 25 centimetres, or approximately a foot in length. The other thing here is that although we've described it as looking relatively benign, it does have a somewhat intimidating appearance when we talk about its legs. There are 4 legs on the headcrab, and they are long and claw-like, almost like a long finger ending in a hook-like claw rather than a nail. The other thing here is that they do rather resemble a raw, uncooked chicken. That is until they start jumping at you, and the headcrab can jump. They can go about 3 meters or 10 feet to get to its victim. Understand that by comparison, a human can jump roughly similar distances, but we're also roughly 3 to 4 times their size. However, unlike the headcrab, humans are rather more flexible. The headcrab can jump or lunge at exceptional speed, and it will be able to reach its target, but it cannot rotate freely. It is in some ways comparable to a ball that can charge fast, but is somewhat slower to turn around and try again. If you are hit by the headcrab but it does not reach your head, it's not something you're going to be able to easily ignore, and will likely knock you down, with each headcrab weighing around 8 pounds or 3.5 kilograms. This is roughly the equivalent weight to an Olympic shot put ball, or the weight of a small black powder cannon. Admittedly, it's the cannon ball rather than the cannon itself. With the headcrab weighing about 3.5 kilograms and launching itself about 5 to 5.5 meters by our calculations in about half a second, it's going to hit you with about 211 joules. A comparison to this would be a football player hitting another. The average plays about 90 kilograms and travels at 5 meters a second, and it will hit the other, let's say, opposing team member with about 1,100 joules. That means a footballer hitting another footballer, typically going in the opposite direction, with about 5 times the force of a headcrab. Admittedly, that does assume an equivalent-sized human and so on, so the rather unsuspecting and often very lonely scientist, who probably weighs less than the headcrab when wet, being hit by the same headcrab is probably going to be knocked on their ass. Now that you are suitably aware of the imminent direct physical threat of the headcrab, we can look at its biology and, to an extent, its function. There are, first of all, a few different kinds of headcrab we need to talk about, and to be clear about it, they all sort of build on the standard headcrab as it's called, and its life cycle and process are fairly simple. It's going to jump on your head and try and put itself a little bit forward, so that it sits more directly on top of your head rather than just somewhere on it. It's then going to somewhat force your head backwards, so that the mouth underneath it, not the front mouth, can get a good solid grip, and then it's going to open up your skull. The front claws will burrow into your shoulders in order to do this, and the back legs will try and attach themselves to the back of your head. Now, the back legs are also not only there to help establish its connection, but also to help it, attach itself to your nervous system, as do the teeth in its mouth. The mouth itself is nightmarishly expendable. It's rather like a long tube. Think of it like a stocking or a long sock that can stretch, which is why it can fit on just about all human heads, no matter how big or small. The trunk-like structure that's within that mouth, it's like a probiscus, then goes down through the mouth and starts burrowing through the head and into the spinal cord. And this is eventually going to lead to a rather terrifying development as it begins to modify parts of the body. It does so by essentially chewing its way through your chest, throat, and similar until it gets down to the lower part of your chest towards where your stomach's located, that general area. And it's going to use that to feed itself through the hands of the victim. If the headcrab victim, let's say, eventually dies, it should have grown bigger and stronger by that time. It will then go and search for a new, let's call it host. And this new host will undergo the same unpleasant, if not terrifying experience. There are also another variation on this, and these are called the fast headcrabs, and they are fundamentally the same as the standard headcrab. They're just, unsurprisingly, faster. But they also seem to be a little more cognizant of their environment and will go out of their way to avoid certain threats and move more actively. They'll also go out of their way to actually search for a new victim far more strenuously than the standard headcrab will. Unlike the standard headcrab, the fast headcrab does do one thing that's a little bit unique, and that is, it is far more aggressive in its behaviour. That is, it will try and attack other humans or anything else it finds that it thinks is a threat, with little regard for its own body. The last, let's call it a standard type of headcrab, is the poison headcrab, and these seem to be what you could arguably describe as the last evolution of the normal headcrab, so to say. And we say this as they appear to be able to reproduce to some extent, or at least produce offspring of some kind. And let's say they support their offspring by having them clamber on the back of the particular host they found and feed themselves that way. Functionally, they are relatively similar to your standard headcrab, although they do a couple of things that are a little more important. First of all, they appear to exhibit a neurotoxin production ability, which does immobilize their victim. They also don't seem to let go of their victim, whereas the regular headcrabs and the fast headcrabs have been known to let go of their victim, either because they've been damaged or they need to run away, or they've otherwise been scared to some extent. The other effect is that because the poison headcrab remains attached for so long, the body begins to break down much more readily, and, well, as you can imagine with any kind of biodegradation of the human body, a bloating occurs, mostly from the buildup of gases from microbes within your GI tract. Lastly, the poison headcrab is known to throw its offspring at new possible hosts, thereby not only expanding the number of infected, but speeding up the whole process. There are also a few other headcrabs that either do not fit the general terms of headcrab that we've described so far, or are somewhat of a specialized subset that mostly just exaggerates already described features. These include the armoured headcrab, which is mostly just a somewhat stronger and more resilient version of the normal headcrab, but it does have a glowing vulnerability on its bottom, as all good video game characters and enemies will. The reviver, which is a somewhat fast and agile headcrab, but it's unique in that it can produce electric shocks that can revive various dead bodies, or at least reanimate them into a functioning zombie for all intents and purposes. And finally we have the gonarch. Gonarch likely being some sort of portmanteau on the words gonad and monarch. It's said to be a mature form of the headcrab, and it will spawn its own baby headcrabs directly without the need for a host, and it itself does not use one. It is instead basically a giant pair of testicles hanging down from 4 legs. Headcrabs are a parasitic species, and this should be clear by now, and they will attach themselves to some unwitting host's head, clamping down on the skull and using their teeth, which are described as a beak, to break through and access the nice gooey goodness that is the human brain, or whatever their host would have naturally been. What is unique compared to other species that might do something similar is that the headcrab takes control of the host's motor functions. Now, Half-Life and the various games that came afterwards don't explain this process very well, but we'll attempt to do so later on. The key thing here is that by taking advantage of the control of the host's motor function, the aim is to keep them alive for as long as possible, or at least attempt to do so. The challenge is that, well, how do you go from being random person wandering around to zombie? We know that it takes a few seconds to a few minutes for a headcrab to turn a human into a zombie, which raises some pretty big questions about this. We also know that they don't seem to target anything that isn't a human, meaning that other species, or at least other xenos, aren't vulnerable, and this would, to some extent, indicate that the headcrab has never evolved in an environment that had access to something that wasn't human-like, or at least close enough to a human that it would explain why we make up a reasonable host for them. The part about them that is, to an extent, terrifying is that all victims appear to retain some degree of consciousness. The standard headcrab zombies have the ability to talk, can be heard to exhibit violent screams calling for help, and can speak with, some assistance. Yeah, you basically are locked into a body where, sure, you can scream and people will hear you, but you have no way to do anything about it. It's like the locked-in condition, except worse, somehow. We won't go into a great deal of detail on the variations that headcrab variants make to the human zombie that they produce, but understand that there is some variation. What is weird is that headcrabs must have some modicum of cognitive functioning, and by that we mean ability to actually think, as they can be tamed. They can literally be turned into pets. But in order to make them into a pet, you must remove their beaks, the teeth that they use to latch onto your head, and, well, turn you into a zombie. Strangely though, removing the beak, so to say, does appear to remove their impulse to turn any human they see into a zombie as well. It's not to say that it completely removes any attempt to do so, as the examples from Half-Life show that there is at least some presence of the desire to nom on anything vaguely head-shaped, but for the most part it's drastically reduced. Similar to how, say, neutering a dog will make it less horny. And presumably giving a teenager access to the internet will make them more horny. In terms of the actual content, it seems that at least the normal kinds of headcrabs, barring the poisonous kind, are edible, or at least edible as far as water gaunts are concerned. Now, whether or not they're edible for humans, that one's going to be a little more questionable. It would make sense, given that they parasitize humans, that they aren't poisonous, at least as far as the normal and fast headcrabs are concerned. There is some fairly major questions as to the poisonous headcrab, however. The big problem we do have is, well, how do you link the headcrab nervous system to the human nervous system to allow at least some degree of somatic control, or in simpler terms, how does the headcrab control the victim's muscles in particular? Remember that even today, with fairly advanced technology, we can't effectively, or at least on a large scale and reliable scale, link the muscular system of the human body with any kind of external control or vice versa. The closest we managed are very unique, very customized prototype clinical trial prosthetics, and even they are fairly crass and crude. They don't have the degree of fine motor control you would necessarily need in this instance. In order to get the headcrab to zombify the human host, at least enough to assume control of the somatic functions, we must overcome this fairly rudimentary hurdle, and it is fundamental to the entire thing. For the most part, this is really the only thing the headcrab takes control of most of the time. We will need to later consider the headcrab also induces a degree of greater aggression, but that might be easier explained than the integration of very different, very competing neurosystems. So first we have somatic control. The easiest way that the headcrab assumes some kind of direct control would be, well, direct interference. This would require the headcrab be able to not just understand, but interact with the human motor cortex. This doesn't seem likely. Considering they are literally aliens and fairly rudimentary creatures, this seems, if not impossible, far too unlikely to be worth considering in much depth. The human brain is fairly straightforward in terms of the motor cortex, which would give them control over your muscles. It's a band of the brain that if you were to poke and prod in the right way, you could get reactions, but the headcrab would not just need to be able to do this quickly, given it takes seconds to minutes to turn them into a zombie, but also actually know what it's doing, which, well, alien, not likely. Next is to hijack the spinal cord, and the motor neuron signals that travel the length of the spine. This actually fits somewhat better, not because of the more practical possibility, but behavior. Remember that the headcrab sends down that rather disturbing probiscus-like structure, and the victim is expected to feed it via it? Well, this is run down the entire length of their chest cavity and into their abdomen. The mouth and parts of the throat that are not controlled by the motor signals from the spine would also explain some of what we're observing here. Your mouth, your face, and a few other parts of your body are not controlled directly from the spine, but instead through something called cranial nerves. This would explain why the zombies can still express groans and cries of pain and a desire to die, as the muscle control for this is not being taken away by the headcrab. They might well wish they did though, since, well, they're probably just wishing for death. However, other muscles such as the arms and legs are not so lucky. They can be subsumed almost entirely. The challenge here is how the headcrab would control the spinal cord accurately. It is, for all intents and purposes, a long series of nerves, and each terminates eventually, but there's no obvious way to reach that degree of fine interaction and consequential control. Think of it this way. If you were given a bundle of wires that were all looped together, essentially a faggot of sticks, and told that you need to be able to get one of them out from the side, do you think you could actually do so? Remembering that it's almost like a Jenga tower. You need to be able to get out one brick without the entire thing falling over. It's not going to work so well. It could be solved though, and this would be the next option. What you would be doing is stimulating the spinal cord at different rates and powers. This would send the signal all the way down the spine or only part way. The problem with this solution is that it would require the arms be innervated first, then the lower limbs, which is not what we see. This would be somewhat akin to the reviver headcrab, but it lacks the specificity needed. The last practical option is arguably taking all these pre-existing ideas and knowledge and applying it. It does provide us with a level of interaction done by the probiscus going down and into the abdomen and the thorax of your unsuspecting victim, but also by essentially extending out small spine-like structures or something similar. They could insert their own parallel control system alongside the spine. This could either run in the spinal cord or, given what we've mentioned, probably in front of the spinal cord, and then the probiscus-like structure would send out these small innervating structures to either side of the spinal cord. Now, the benefit of this is that, technically speaking, all of the structures needed are still there, so the body has the essentially sensation of moving, going back up into the brain, and the brain's natural structures involved with things like balance and so on would allow for the head crab to be able to maintain balance without having to have its own direct involvement in doing so. This would provide the same level of control, but it would not require the spine be tampered with. Remembering that we've already established that, at least to some extent, head crab variations can produce a certain amount of charge, enough of a charge at least to resurrect people into zombies. This would allow the head crab to rely on only its own nervous system to send signals to these motor neurons, and by doing so, it would be able to say, this muscle here needs to be innervated, by sending a signal out, down, through the probiscus-like structure, to the spinal cord and to the right place. It might also explain why it takes some time to turn a human with a head crab into a zombie. They would need to both grow out these structures, or at least extend them out, like a fungus grows a rhizome, but also learn what corresponds to what kind of movement. Admittedly, a few seconds seems perhaps overly ambitious, but certainly something that might be achieved within a few minutes given the very rudimentary nature of the head crab. This level of control would work if, as with the reviver head crab, they can generate enough of an electrical potential to initiate neuron action potentials outside of the spine. Once control of the host is achieved, it wouldn't make sense that the head crab begins to secrete some sort of aggression-generating drug. Imagine something like a steroid rage, but without the tight underwear, posing, and shrunken testicles. Instead, you just get the sort of screaming and raging at anyone and anything that comes with steroid use. This would also only need to be a short-term effect, as the host is not expected to survive for an exceptionally long time. So long as they can use the bodily fat stores of energy and obtain at least a minimal moisture from either the environment or victims, there is no need for anything else. Note that in theory, the victims don't need to be human, but could, if the available foodstuffs become limited, or otherwise aren't available, other zombies in the form of cannibalism could be seen as food. Since the poison head crabs secrete a neurotoxin, it would not be that surprising to see a less refined version of neurotoxin simply produce some sort of aggression, rather than shutting down the nervous system and immobilizing the victim. Since the head crab can use the host as an incubator, at least for head crab offspring, it makes the idea of a systematic infection to achieve control at least somewhat more likely. The same mechanisms used to spread the neuron analog throughout the body of the host may also allow the head crab to spread its eggs throughout the zombie. This is similar to how fungi spreads throughout a tree. Its rhizomes grow and spread until it gets to a point where it can produce fruiting bodies, the mushroom. These then open and release spores to spread the mushroom fungi even further and to new hosts again. Rather obviously, there would need to be some further adaptation and engineering of the head crab for this to work, as they are rather obviously not a fungi. The biggest issue will be just how they reproduce, and does the head crab get born as such, completely ready to reproduce, or do they need some kind of mating process? We can look at this and think perhaps not necessarily. It would very much depend on the generation. For example, we have the gonarch, and this is supposed to produce the head crabs, and it might be possible that the immature head crab produced as offspring from it are completely fertile, essentially a first generation after the gonarch, but any third generation coming from these would be sterile. Theoretically, this gives you a gonarch which presumably has some sort of internal reproductive system, such as being hermaphroditic, and similar to the banana slug can impregnate itself, then a second generation that is born already fertilized, and then a third generation that is sterile until it grows up. This would make more sense, since the gonarch does not use a host and certainly does not produce anything that's of its own size. Instead, all of its offspring, so to say, are otherwise similar size to the standard head crab, where the gonarch is basically a giant walking pair of testicles. This is the nightmare fuel that is the head crab. Strangely enough, the terrifying aspect is supposedly why the headcrab was not present in Half-Life Alyx. The developers thought it would be too much to encounter a zombie headcrab or similar creature in a virtual reality setting, and certainly it would be true. It would be horrifying to turn a corner and encounter one of these things, whether it is the headcrab itself or the zombie victim. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.